On the night of August 30th, 1997, a black Mercedes slipped out of the back entrance of the Ritz Hotel in Paris. They thought they'd gone unnoticed. They hadn't. What happened in the next 23 minutes would stop the world, and the question of whether it was avoidable has never fully gone away. But to understand that night, you first have to understand the life that led to it. The girl who wasn't supposed to exist. Diana Frances Spencer was born on July 1st, 1961, at Park House in Sandringham, Norfolk, a home her family rented on Queen Elizabeth II's own estate. It sounds grand. The surrounding grounds were royal. The address carried weight. But her arrival was wrapped in something closer to disappointment. Her parents, Viscount and Viscountess Althorpe, had been desperately hoping for a son. They already had two daughters, Sarah, born in 1955, and Jane, born in 1957. Then came a boy, John, who died just hours after his birth in 1960. The grief was enormous, the pressure immense. Viscountess Althorpe was even sent to clinics on Harley Street in London to determine why she had failed to produce a healthy male heir. An experience that her son Charles would later describe as humiliating and as one of the root causes of his parents' eventual divorce. When Diana arrived the following year, no name was even chosen for a full week. The family eventually settled on Diana Frances, after her mother and a distant ancestor who had also borne the Spencer name. But the unspoken sting of that welcome would follow her in ways no one could have predicted. Their fourth child, and the longed-for son, finally came in 1964, Diana's brother, Charles Spencer. By then the marriage had sustained too much damage to recover. The Spencers separated in 1967 when Diana was just 6 years old. The divorce was finalized in 1969. Her father won custody of all the children, and Diana and her brother were left at Park House while their older sisters were already away at boarding school. What followed was years of shuttling between parents' homes in the care of a series of nannies, a hollowness at the center of things, and a childhood marked by the particular loneliness of children who feel they were not quite what was hoped for. She later described those years as very unhappy and very unstable, the whole thing. Her father remarried in 1976, a woman named Rain, Countess of Dartmouth, who was widely disliked by all four Spencer children. Diana referred to her stepmother as a bully, and the relationship between them was genuinely hostile. On at least one occasion, Diana pushed Rain down a flight of stairs. The resentment was deep, and it was lasting. When her father inherited the title of Earl Spencer in 1975, the family moved from Park House to the grand ancestral estate of Althorpe in Northamptonshire, and Diana became Lady Diana Spencer. The title was new. The loneliness was not. She was sent to boarding school, first Riddlesworth Hall in Norfolk, then West Heath in Sevenoaks, Kent. She was not an academic success by any conventional measure. She failed her O-level exams twice, which effectively ended any possibility of university. But she shone in other ways, as a swimmer, a dancer, as someone with genuine warmth that other people could feel immediately. At West Heath, she regularly volunteered with elderly residents in care homes and attended events supporting people with disabilities. She won a prize at school for kindness. The compassion was not performance. It was simply who she was. At 16, she briefly attended a finishing school at the Institut Alpine Vida Manette in Switzerland, but hated it so completely that she begged her family to let her come home. By 18, her parents had bought her a small flat in South Kensington, London, which she shared with 3 friends. She worked part-time as an assistant at the Young England kindergarten in Pimlico and as a nanny. Those who knew her in those years remember her as genuine, funny, and completely unguarded, a young woman who had no idea what was about to happen to her life. She was 20 years old and working with small children when everything changed. But the man who changed it hadn't noticed her yet. And when he finally did, the story that followed was far more complicated than any fairy tale, and far more painful than anyone watching from the outside could have guessed from the photographs. The wedding, the world watched. Diana first encountered Prince Charles in November 1977 when he came to visit her family home at Althorpe for a shooting party. At the time, he was dating her older sister, Sarah. Diana was just 16. She barely registered on his radar. Their paths crossed again more regularly after her sister Jane married Robert Fellows, who worked at Buckingham Palace. Then, in July 1980, at a barbecue in Sussex, Charles finally saw her differently. Diana had expressed sympathy for the grief he was still carrying following the assassination of his uncle Lord Mountbatten the previous year. She sat beside him in a field, and something about her directness and warmth caught him off guard. He began paying closer attention. What neither of them fully acknowledged at the time, and what the royal family certainly chose not to examine closely, was the extent to which Charles was still emotionally attached to Camilla Parker Bowles, whom he had loved since 1970 and could not marry because she was not considered a suitable bride. Camilla had married Andrew Parker Bowles in 1973. Charles was expected to find a suitable match of his own. In Diana, the palace saw what they needed. She was young, aristocratic, Protestant, and by all accounts without the kind of complicated romantic history that would cause tabloid difficulties. She was also, by the account of at least one royal aide at the time, an asset, someone who could revitalize public interest in the monarchy. He proposed on February 6, 1981, at Windsor Castle. She accepted. The engagement was kept secret for nearly 3 weeks before being announced to the world on February 24th. At the press conference that followed, a reporter asked whether they were in love. Diana said yes without hesitation. Charles famously added, "Whatever in love means." That qualifier went mostly unremarked at the time. It would not be forgotten later. The period between the engagement and the wedding was harder than Diana had expected. She moved first to Clarence House, then to Buckingham Palace, and found herself remarkably isolated. Her former flatmates were gone. Her kindergarten job was over. She was living inside one of the most formal institutions in the world, with almost no preparation and very little support. Her biographer, Ingrid Seward, later described her life in those weeks as incredibly lonely. She lost so much weight from stress in the months before the wedding that her dress had to be repeatedly altered. The wedding took place on July 29th, 1981, at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Diana wore a silk taffeta gown with a 25-foot train, designed by David and Elizabeth Emanuel. Her veil was held in place by the Spencer family tiara. The streets of London were lined with 600,000 people. Around the world, an estimated 750 million watched on television. It was, at the time, the most watched broadcast in television history. She was 20 years old. What the cameras couldn't capture was what Diana was feeling as she walked down that aisle. Later, she would reveal that she had been scanning the pews for one person, Camilla Parker Bowles. She found her. Pale grey hat, veiled. The memory, she said, was seared into her mind forever. There was something else she would later reveal that almost no one knew at the time. The night before the wedding, according to accounts that emerged in the years that followed, Charles told Diana he didn't love her, apparently in an attempt to be honest before the ceremony went forward. She went ahead with it anyway. The honeymoon began at Broadlands in Hampshire, then continued aboard the royal yacht HMY Britannia through the Mediterranean to Egypt. By the time they returned, Diana had already begun to unravel quietly inside a life she hadn't fully understood she was entering. She was not prepared. Nobody prepared her. There was no instruction manual for what it meant to go from working in a kindergarten to becoming the most photographed woman in the world overnight. Within months, she was struggling with severe postnatal depression after Prince William's birth in June 1982, something the royal family reportedly treated as a behavioral problem rather than a medical one. The press corps followed her every move, and the growing awareness that her husband's relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles had not ended on their wedding day was settling into her understanding like a stone into cold water. Prince Harry was born in September 1984. Publicly, the family looked complete. Behind closed doors, the marriage was already coming apart at the seams, and the full story of exactly how was about to become very, very public, starting with a discovery that Diana made and a confrontation that nobody in her circle saw coming. 3. In a marriage. By 1986, Charles and Diana were living largely separate lives under the same roof. Their public appearances, once filled with the electricity of a world watching, had become stiff and managed. Queen Elizabeth II was reportedly so alarmed by the visible distance between them that she instructed the couple to appear together in public more often, simply to quiet the growing speculation. Behind closed doors, Charles had resumed his relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles. They had first met in 1970, and Charles had reportedly considered proposing, but she was not deemed a suitable match for the heir to the throne at the time. She married Andrew Parker Bowles in 1973. Charles married Diana in 1981. But the connection between Charles and Camilla had never truly ended, and by the fall of 1986, according to biographers, they had rekindled the affair in full. Diana knew. She had known for some time. The discovery of a bracelet Charles had purchased for Camilla before the wedding had confirmed what she'd sensed. She described the feeling as a slow freezing over, the realization that she was the official face of a marriage that was already, in the most important ways, over. In the summer of 1986, Diana began her own affair with James Hewitt, a captain in the Life Guards Cavalry Regiment who had been giving her riding lessons. The relationship lasted until 1991. She would later acknowledge it openly, describing herself as deeply in love with him at the time, and equally devastated when, in 1994, a book written with his cooperation and based on his account of their relationship was published, which she called a profound betrayal. By 1989, Diana had reached a point she could no longer contain. She attended the 40th birthday party of Camilla's sister, Annabel, at a house near Richmond, knowing full well that both Charles and Camilla would be there. Nobody expected her to show up. She went anyway. She found Charles and Camilla together in a side room, excused the men who were with them, and confronted Camilla directly. She told her she knew exactly what was happening, that she wasn't blind and wasn't stupid. Camilla, according to Diana's own accounts, responded by asking why Diana was so worried, since she had everything she could want. Diana's reply was simple. She had nothing. She had nothing at all. She walked out of that room feeling, she said, like something enormous had shifted, like she had finally said what needed to be said. The marriage did not improve, but something in Diana did. In June 1992, the biography Diana, Her True Story, written by Andrew Morton and based on secret tape recordings Diana had made herself in the privacy of her apartments at Kensington Palace, was published to an enormous and immediate explosion of public attention. It pulled back the curtain on everything: the unhappiness from the earliest years of the marriage, the eating disorder she had developed as a way of managing pain she had no other outlet for, her deteriorating mental health, the affairs on both sides, and the extraordinary loneliness of a woman living inside one of the world's most public institutions and finding it utterly devoid of warmth. Morton had claimed at the time that Diana was not directly involved in the book. Decades later, those tapes made clear she had been the primary source all along. She had sat alone in a private room and recorded hours of deeply honest testimony, a document of her experience that she knew eventually would find its way into the world. The public reaction was electric. So was the royal family's fury. The tabloids went into overdrive. For weeks, the story dominated every front page. The television cameras followed both Charles and Diana everywhere, trying to read in their public appearances what the book had set loose behind closed doors. The couple continued their official duties, appearing together at events that now felt like a performance of a marriage that had already ceased to exist. 6 months later, in December 1992, the Prime Minister announced in the House of Commons that Charles and Diana had officially separated. They had not yet divorced, but the marriage, in every real sense, was finished. What came next, nobody inside the palace could have anticipated, and it would be broadcast directly into the living rooms of 200 million people around the world. The interview that shook a monarchy. In the autumn of 1995, a BBC journalist named Martin Bashir approached Diana with a proposal. He wanted to conduct a full, candid interview about her life inside the royal family. He had been granted access, in part, through a series of deceptions: forged bank statements shown to her brother Earl Spencer, and a web of false claims designed to win Diana's trust. This was not discovered until decades later. Diana agreed. The interview was filmed secretly in her sitting room at Kensington Palace on November 5, 1995, with recording equipment smuggled in under the pretense of installing a new hi-fi system. Even the BBC's own Board of Governors was kept in the dark. It aired on November 20th, 1995, on the BBC's Panorama programme. Nearly 23 million people watched it in the United Kingdom alone. Across 100 countries, the worldwide audience was estimated at 200 million. What Diana said in that sitting room, quietly, carefully, and with disarming directness, broke something open that could never be put back together. She spoke about her struggle with an eating disorder, describing it as her body's way of communicating the pain she hadn't been able to express any other way. She spoke about her mental health, about the times she had hurt herself, and about the isolation she had felt inside a family that viewed her condition as evidence of instability rather than a cry for help. She confirmed that her husband had resumed his relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles, describing the situation in a way that became one of the most quoted lines of the decade. The image of 3 people occupying a marriage that was only meant for 2. She also confirmed her own affair with James Hewitt, saying she had been in love with him and that she had been deeply wounded when he chose to profit from their relationship publicly. When asked about Charles's fitness to be king, she did not say he was unfit. She simply said it was a question worth asking, and let the implication land where it would. The palace was enraged. Prince William was reportedly overcome with dread when he saw it. Within a month, Queen Elizabeth II wrote letters to both Charles and Diana, urging them to finalize their divorce without further delay. The palace machinery, which had been moving slowly for years, suddenly moved very fast. The divorce was finalized on August 28, 1996. Diana retained her title of Princess of Wales, but lost the style of Her Royal Highness. She remained at Kensington Palace, ran her own office, continued her charity work, and stepped into something she had never quite had before, a life that was, at last, entirely her own. She was 35 years old. She had survived a collapse that would have broken most people, and for the first time in years, the life she was living felt like it actually belonged to her. What she did with it next, the causes she threw herself into, the travels she undertook, and the relationship that defined her final years, turned out to be the most purposeful chapter of her life. The People's Princess. One of the most remarkable things about Diana's later years was what she chose to do with the platform she had, and how differently she used it from anyone who had come before her. Other members of the royal family had always been associated with charities. Diana was different. She didn't lend her name to causes and show up at galas. She walked into places that made the palace deeply uncomfortable, sat with people no one else was sitting with, and held their hands. In April 1987, she visited the first dedicated HIV/AIDS ward in the United Kingdom at the Middlesex Hospital in London. This was the height of the AIDS crisis, a period when fear about the disease was so widespread and so poorly informed that many people believed it could be transmitted through ordinary physical contact. Hospital patients were being avoided by their own families. Public figures steered well clear. Diana sat beside patients, shook their hands without gloves, and embraced them. A photographer captured the moment. It ran on front pages around the world. Doctors working in HIV care said afterward that the impact of that single visit on public perception was immeasurable, that it did more to challenge the stigma around AIDS than years of public health messaging. She visited leprosy clinics. She sat in homeless shelters. She worked with survivors of domestic violence and with children in hospital wards in countries that most people in her position would have considered too difficult, too far, or too dangerous to visit. She went to Angola in January 1997 and to Bosnia in August 1997 as part of a campaign by the International Red Cross to ban anti-personnel landmines. She walked, carefully, through land that had been partially cleared of mines. She sat with children who had lost limbs. She met with landmine survivors and their families, and she spoke about what she had seen in terms that were not carefully managed or diplomatically softened. She was distressed by it, and she allowed people to see that she was. The images went around the world. The campaign to ban landmines was one of the most successful international disarmament efforts of the 20th century. The Ottawa Treaty, which committed 122 nations to banning anti-personnel landmines, was signed in December 1997, 4 months after Diana's death. Her advocacy is widely credited as a significant force in building the public and political will to make it happen. Meanwhile, her private life was continuing to find its footing after the divorce. From 1995 to 1997, she had a serious relationship with Hasnat Khan, a British-Pakistani heart surgeon. Those who knew Diana well consistently describe Khan as the person she loved most deeply in her adult life. He was private, serious, uninterested in celebrity, and completely unglamorous in exactly the ways that seemed to be what she needed. He later confirmed they had discussed marriage. But the gap between her world and any version of a normal life was simply too wide. He could not live inside the eye of the storm that followed her everywhere. In June 1997, the relationship ended. Within weeks, she had begun spending time with Dodi Fayed, the son of Egyptian billionaire Mohammed Al-Fayed. They had met years earlier and reconnected that summer aboard his father's luxury yacht in the Mediterranean. Dodi was charming and generous and entirely comfortable with the attention that surrounded Diana, something very few people in her life had ever been. By August, the two were traveling together openly, and the paparazzi were pursuing them with an intensity that had reached a new and dangerous pitch. It was that intensity, that relentless, commercially driven hunger for a photograph, that followed them from the Mediterranean to Paris in the final days of August 1997. And it was that hunger, combined with a series of decisions made in the early hours of August 31st, that became the context for everything that came next. What happened inside that tunnel lasted less than 2 minutes. The aftermath lasted a lifetime. The last night in Paris. Diana and Dodi arrived in Paris by private jet from Sardinia on the afternoon of August 30th, 1997, after spending more than a week together on the Jonicle. They were driven at high speed from the airport. Diana apparently warned during that drive that someone was going to get hurt. The paparazzi were already tracking them before their car had left the airport road. They checked into the Ritz, owned by Dodi's father. They attempted to dine out that evening at a restaurant on the Rue de Benoit, but the flood of photographers waiting outside made it impossible. They retreated back to the hotel and dined privately in the Imperial Suite. Earlier that day, Dodi had visited a jeweler and purchased a ring, a diamond and sapphire piece from the Ripossi collection. What his intentions were remains a matter of dispute. His father, Mohammed Al-Fayed, would later claim the couple were engaged and the ring was a formal proposal token. Others close to Diana denied any such engagement was planned. Forensic analysis conducted as part of later investigations found no evidence Diana was pregnant, as some conspiracy theories suggested. Just after midnight on August 31st, the couple prepared to leave the hotel for Dodi's apartment on the Rue Arsène Houssaye, near the Arc de Triomphe. Knowing the paparazzi were massed outside the main entrance, they arranged a decoy. One car left from the front of the hotel to draw the photographers away, while Diana and Dodi slipped out through a rear exit. It didn't work. At 12:20 in the morning, Diana, Dodi, and bodyguard Trevor Rees-Jones climbed into a black Mercedes-Benz, driven by Henri Paul, the Ritz's deputy head of security. Paul had been called back to the hotel that evening after going off duty and spending part of the night elsewhere in Paris. Security camera footage showed him walking steadily in the lobby, chatting with staff. But forensic tests conducted after the crash would find his blood alcohol level at more than 3 times the French legal limit, combined with traces of antidepressants and a tranquilizing medication. Neither Diana nor Dodi were wearing seatbelts. Rees-Jones, in the front passenger seat, was. The Mercedes pulled away from the Ritz into the Paris night, immediately followed by photographers on motorcycles and in cars. Paul drove fast, down the Rue de Rivoli, across the Place de la Concorde, along the River Road. One witness later described the car as moving so quickly through the approach to the Alma Tunnel that it appeared to be almost airborne. At 12:23 in the morning, the car entered the Pont de l'Alma Tunnel. It was moving at an estimated speed of between 65 and 100 miles per hour. Inside the tunnel, Henri Paul lost control of the vehicle. The Mercedes sideswiped a white Fiat Uno that was traveling in the right lane, was destabilized, and struck the 13th concrete support pillar of the tunnel head-on. Henri Paul and Dodi Fayed were killed instantly. Trevor Rees-Jones, the only passenger wearing a seatbelt, survived, though with catastrophic injuries. He retained no memory of the crash itself. Diana was alive. She was conscious, at least briefly. A French doctor named Frédéric Maillier, who happened to be driving through the tunnel and stopped when he saw the wreckage, was one of the first to reach her. She was moving, disoriented, asking what had happened. He called for emergency services and attempted to stabilize her. French emergency protocols at the time involved treating patients at the scene before transport, rather than rushing them immediately to hospital. Diana was in the tunnel for more than an hour before being moved. She was taken to the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital, where surgeons operated for hours to address the catastrophic internal bleeding caused by a rupture to the pulmonary vein near her heart. At 4 o'clock in the morning on August 31st, 1997, Diana, Princess of Wales, was pronounced dead. She was 36 years old. The paparazzi who had been in pursuit of the car did not call for help when they arrived at the scene. Instead, some of them photographed Diana through the broken windows of the car while she was still alive. Those photographs were confiscated by French authorities and never published. 3 photographers were later convicted of invasion of privacy and ordered to pay a symbolic fine of €1 each. Prince Harry would say years later that one of the hardest things he ever had to reckon with was the knowledge that the people who had chased his mother into that tunnel were the same people who stood there taking pictures of her while she was dying. And when the news reached London, what happened next was something no one in Britain had ever quite seen before. A world stops. The announcement came in the early hours of August 31st. By dawn, the flowers had already started arriving at Kensington Palace. Over the course of the following days, more than 1 million bouquets were left outside the palace gates. The pile of flowers stretched 30 feet deep in places. Cards and photographs and handwritten notes were tucked between the stems. People stood in silence for hours, or wept openly in the street, or simply sat down on the pavement, unable to explain what they were feeling or why it felt so personal. Grief counsellors were deployed to public gathering spaces. Mental health helplines were overwhelmed with calls. It was, by every measure, a collective emotional response that Britain had never seen before and has not seen since. What made it stranger still was the nature of the grief itself. Most of the people weeping outside Kensington Palace had never met Diana. She had never sat with them, never held their hand, never visited their town. And yet the feeling of personal loss was genuine, not manufactured, not media-driven. She had been a constant presence for so many years, in so many images and moments, that her absence created a gap that felt real. There is no easy explanation for it. It simply was. The royal family's response, however, was not what the public expected or needed. Queen Elizabeth II remained at Balmoral Castle in Scotland with Charles and the boys, following the traditional royal practice of grieving privately and away from public view. No substantial public statement came immediately. The flag over Buckingham Palace flew at full mast, standard protocol, since it only flew at half-mast for a reigning monarch's death. To a public already raw and furious with grief, the silence and the unchanged flag felt like indifference, like proof of everything Diana had said in the Panorama interview about a family that couldn't understand the importance of human feeling. The British press turned on the palace with a ferocity that had rarely been directed at the monarchy in the modern era. Front pages ran questions about why the Queen was not in London, why she hadn't spoken directly to the public, why the flag wasn't lowered. The criticism was enormous, and it came not from political opponents of the monarchy, but from ordinary people who had lined up to lay flowers for a woman the royal family had, by many accounts, made to feel unwelcome. After several days of mounting pressure, Queen Elizabeth II returned to London and delivered a live television broadcast. A rare and deliberate act, given how carefully she rationed such appearances. She spoke about Diana as someone she had admired, as a human being separate from her role as a royal. It was not what everyone had wanted, but it was something. The flag over Buckingham Palace was lowered. The palace gates were opened. The distance between the institution and the people it served narrowed, a little for a moment. Diana's funeral was held on September 6, 1997, at Westminster Abbey. Her coffin was carried through London on a horse-drawn gun carriage, its route lined by hundreds of thousands of people standing in silence or throwing flowers. Prince Charles walked behind the coffin alongside Prince Philip. Alongside them walked Earl Spencer and, behind them, William and Harry, a 15-year-old and a 12-year-old, walking through the streets of London in front of the entire world, behind their mother's coffin, in a display of public grief that many who witnessed it have described as one of the most devastating things they ever saw. Inside the Abbey, Earl Spencer delivered a eulogy that addressed, directly and without softening, the tension between the institution Diana had married into and the person she had actually been. He spoke of a woman who needed kindness as much as she gave it, and who had not always received it. He spoke of his nephews and his hope that their lives would not be entirely defined by duty and tradition. The address was received with applause from the crowds outside the Abbey, a sound that rolled through the open doors and filled the church. It was the first time in anyone's living memory that applause had been heard inside Westminster Abbey during a funeral service. Elton John, who had known Diana personally for many years, performed a version of his song Candle in the Wind, which Bernie Taupin had rewritten specifically as a tribute. The single was released days after the funeral and became one of the best-selling musical recordings in history. The worldwide television audience for the funeral was estimated at 2.5 billion people, a staggering number, and a fitting, if painful, measure of a life lived almost entirely in public view. Epilogue: What she left behind. In the years since her death, Diana's life has become the subject of documentaries, films, television series, musicals, books, and arguments that show no sign of ending. The Netflix series, The Crown, brought her story to millions of new viewers around the world. The 2021 film Spencer, in which actress Kristen Stewart played her, was nominated for an Academy Award. In 2021, the revelations about the deceptive methods used to secure the Panorama interview came fully into public light. William and Harry both made public statements. The BBC committed to never broadcasting the interview again and encouraged other broadcasters to do the same. And journalist Martin Bashir offered an apology that many in Diana's circle considered inadequate. The inquest into her death, the longest and most expensive in British legal history, concluded in April 2008. A jury of 6 women and 5 men listened to more than 250 witnesses over 6 months. They returned a verdict of unlawful killing, caused by the grossly negligent driving of Henry Paul, whose impairment by alcohol and medication, combined with the aggressive manner in which the pursuing paparazzi drove, led directly to the crash. The jury also found that the failure of Diana, Dodi, and Henri Paul to wear seatbelts contributed to their deaths. Trevor Rees-Jones, the one person in the car wearing a seatbelt, was the only survivor. Conspiracy theories have never gone away. Mohammed Al-Fayed maintained until his own death in 2023 that his son and Diana were murdered as part of a coordinated plot involving the British security services and members of the royal family. Independent forensic investigations found no evidence to support that claim. The British coroner presiding over the inquest stated explicitly that there was no conspiracy, but the theories persist, perhaps inevitably, in the case of a death that felt so impossible, so abrupt, for a woman who had been so very much alive. What is not a theory, and has never been in dispute, is what Diana actually did while she was here. She changed the way AIDS patients were perceived. She changed the international conversation around landmines. She changed, permanently, the contract between the British royal family and the people it was supposed to represent, introducing a standard of warmth and accessibility that the institution has been trying to meet ever since. She walked into hospital wards, sat in refugee camps, held the hands of people the world preferred not to look at, and did it not because a press secretary told her to, but because it was the only kind of power she had ever really wanted to use. She was 36 years old when she died. She had been the most watched woman in the world for 16 of those years. She had filled more front pages, been the subject of more camera lenses, been observed and analysed and speculated about more thoroughly than perhaps any private individual in history. And in all that time, in all those photographs, in all those cameras pointed at her face, what comes through again and again is not the glamour or the drama or the noise of a fractured royal marriage. What comes through is a woman who wanted, more than anything, to matter to the people directly in front of her, who did, who always will. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. There's a photograph that most people have never seen. Dodi Fayed leaning back in a chair, laughing at something just out of frame, completely at ease, completely alive. It was taken less than 48 hours before he died. Most of what gets talked about is her, which is understandable. But what gets talked about far less is him, the man in the passenger seat, who he actually was, what his life looked like, and what the official investigations eventually concluded about how it all ended. That's what we're here for today. Who Dodi Fayed actually was. Imad el-Din Mohammed Abdel-Munim. Fayed was born on April 15th, 1955, in Alexandria, Egypt. Most people only ever knew him as Dodi, and most people only ever knew him as one thing, the son of Mohammed al-Fayed, the billionaire businessman who owned Harrods department store in London and the Hotel Ritz Paris. That's the version of Dodi that the tabloids printed. The playboy, the heir, the man who moved through the world on his father's money and his father's name. But people who actually knew him described someone a little more complicated than that. Dodi grew up largely separated from his father. His parents divorced when he was very young, and he was raised primarily by his mother's family in Egypt and later in Switzerland. His mother, Samira Khashoggi, was the sister of arms dealer Adnan Khashoggi, which meant Dodi was born into a world of extraordinary wealth on both sides of his family. That kind of upbringing leaves a mark. It can make a person feel like they are always standing in the doorway of someone else's room. He attended the prestigious Sandhurst Military Academy in England, the same institution that trains British Army officers, though he did not complete the full programme. He also studied briefly at the London Film School. These details are easy to skim past, but they matter, because they paint a picture of someone who was genuinely trying to find a direction, not just coasting. He ended up in London in the mid-1970s, and then, inevitably, gravitating toward the film industry. This part of his life tends to get glossed over, but it's genuinely interesting. Dodi wasn't just a passive financier who threw money at projects to look glamorous. He worked. He was an executive producer on the 1981 film Chariots of Fire, which went on to win the Academy Award for Best Picture. He was involved in other productions through the 1980s and 1990s, including F/X in 1986 and Hook in 1991. The Spielberg production, starring Robin Williams. People who worked with him on those productions remembered him as enthusiastic, sometimes scattered, but genuinely passionate about storytelling. There was a warmth to him, by these accounts, that didn't entirely match the tabloid character. He was someone who remembered birthdays, who called people back, who got excited about ideas in a way that felt real rather than performed. He also had a well-documented romantic life. He dated several high-profile women over the years, including actresses and models whose names filled gossip columns throughout the 1980s. In 1986, he married a model named Suzanne Gregard. That marriage lasted only 8 months. After the divorce, he remained unmarried for the rest of his life, though the tabloids spent years suggesting he was always on the verge of proposing to someone. By the summer of 1997, Dodi Fayed was 42 years old. He was living between London and Los Angeles, working on film projects, and had recently become close to someone whose presence would put both of them under an intensity of public scrutiny that almost defies description. Her name, of course, was Diana. The summer of 1997. The relationship between Dodi Fayed and Diana, Princess of Wales, began in the summer of 1997, though they had met years earlier at a polo match. Mohammed Al Fayed, Dodi's father, had been a long-time friend of Diana's family. When he invited Diana and her sons, William and Harry, to join the Al Fayed family on a holiday in the south of France in early July 1997, it was framed as a casual, friendly trip. A chance for the boys to have a summer vacation away from the relentless press attention that followed Diana everywhere. What happened over those weeks is something that became one of the most photographed and speculated about relationships of the entire decade. Diana and Dodi were photographed together constantly, on yachts, on the beach, in ports along the Mediterranean. The photographs sold for extraordinary amounts of money. Every major tabloid in Britain, France, and beyond was tracking their movements. Editors were willing to pay figures that, even by the standards of 1990s celebrity journalism, were considered remarkable. The British tabloid press had been following Diana since she first appeared on the public stage in the early 1980s. For 16 years, they had tracked her marriage, her struggles, her charities, her friendships, and her relationships. By the summer of 1997, the appetite for photographs of her had not diminished. If anything, it had grown. She was newly divorced. She was reinventing herself publicly. She was, in the eyes of the press and a large portion of the public, the most compelling figure in the world. And now she was, apparently, falling for someone. The question of how serious the relationship actually was, whether it was a casual summer romance or something deeper, became a matter of intense public debate. Friends of Diana gave varying accounts. People close to Dodi said different things to different journalists. One person close to Diana described her as genuinely happy in a way they hadn't seen in years. Others were more cautious, suggesting it was too early to say what it meant. What is documented is this. By August 1997, Diana and Dodi had spent considerable time together across multiple trips. They had been photographed in ways that left little ambiguity about the fact that this was more than a friendship. And they were, by the last week of August, in Paris together. There were reports, unverified and still disputed, that Dodi had purchased a ring from a jeweler in Paris called Repossi, located near the Place Vendôme. The ring was referred to in the press as an engagement ring, though what it actually represented, and whether any formal plans had been discussed, was never conclusively established. The British inquest heard testimony from the jeweller's family and from Ritz staff, and the picture that emerged was genuinely ambiguous, consistent with someone who was serious about the relationship, but not proof of a proposal. What is not disputed is that on the evening of August 30th, 1997, Dodi and Diana had dinner together at the Ritz Paris, a hotel owned by his father, and then made a decision about how to spend the rest of that night. That decision is where everything changes: the Ritz, the paparazzi, and the plan. The Ritz Paris in August 1997 was, by any measure, not a place you could move through quietly if you were Diana, Princess of Wales. She was, at that point, arguably the most photographed woman on the planet. Her divorce from Prince Charles had been finalized the previous year. She had stepped back from many of her official royal duties. She had given the interview that shook the entire British establishment, and she was spending the summer in the company of a man the press was already calling her boyfriend. Dodi and Diana had arrived in Paris on August 30th after a trip to Sardinia. They were staying at the Ritz in the Imperial Suite. Earlier that afternoon, they had visited the Villa Windsor, the historic home where the Duke and Duchess of Windsor had lived after the abdication, which Mohammed Al-Fayed owned and had renovated. The visit was noted by staff and later reported in the press as potentially significant, though what Dodi and Diana discussed there, if anything meaningful, was never established. They had dinner that evening in the Imperial Suite, having abandoned the main restaurant because of the crowd and attention outside. The dinner was described by hotel staff as relaxed. They were there for several hours. The paparazzi presence outside the Ritz that evening was described by witnesses as overwhelming. Photographers had gathered in significant numbers on the Place Vendôme, waiting. Some had been there for hours. The scale of it, the motorcycles, the cameras, the constant repositioning as word spread that the couple was inside, had a quality that went beyond ordinary press coverage into something more like a siege. The original plan for Dodi and Diana that evening had been to leave the Ritz and go to Dodi's apartment on the Rue Arsène Houssaye, near the Arc de Triomphe. This was a relatively short drive through Paris, but as the evening wore on and the crowd of photographers outside showed no sign of dispersing, a different plan was put together. The idea was a decoy. Two vehicles would leave from the front of the hotel, drawing the photographers away. Meanwhile, Dodi and Diana would slip out through a rear entrance on the Rue Cambon and get into a separate car. That car was a black Mercedes S280. The man behind the wheel was Henry Paul. Henry Paul. This is where the story becomes something that investigators, journalists, and legal teams spent years trying to fully understand. Henri Paul was 40 years old. He was the deputy head of security at the Ritz Paris, though he had been serving as acting head since June 1997. He was described by colleagues as competent, professional, and well-liked. He had worked at the Ritz for years and was considered someone who knew the hotel, its guests, and its rhythms intimately. He was not, by any standard definition, a chauffeur. His job was security management, not driving guests. He was also, by all available accounts, someone who took pride in his work. Colleagues described him as meticulous and discreet, the kind of person who understood that working in an environment like the Ritz required a particular kind of professionalism. He had a private pilot's license. He spoke multiple languages. He was, by the evidence, someone who had built a careful career. On the night of August 30th, Henri Paul had not originally been scheduled to work. He had been off duty and had left the hotel earlier in the evening. He was called back when the plan to use a decoy vehicle and a rear exit was being organized. He returned to the Ritz and agreed to drive. What happened inside Henri Paul's body in the hours between when he went off duty and when he got back behind the wheel of that Mercedes became one of the central questions of every investigation that followed. The official French toxicological report, conducted after his death, found that Henri Paul's blood alcohol level at the time of the crash was approximately 3 times the legal limit for driving in France. The report also found traces of prescription medications, specifically a combination of drugs used to treat anxiety and a condition related to alcohol dependency. These findings were disputed almost immediately. Henri Paul's family and some independent experts raised questions about the procedures used in collecting and testing the samples. There were concerns raised about whether samples had been correctly identified and whether contamination was possible. The debate over the toxicology results became, for a period, one of the more technically complex arguments within the broader investigation, involving pathologists, blood specialists, and forensic scientists who did not always agree. A second examination was ordered. The results were consistent with the first. For the official investigations, both the French inquiry and the much later British inquest that concluded in 2008. The conclusion was that Henri Paul was significantly impaired when he got into that car. But here is what made the whole thing harder to resolve neatly. Witnesses who saw Henri Paul inside the Ritz that evening, in the time before he drove, gave accounts that varied considerably. Some said he seemed perfectly normal. Some said he had been drinking. Some said they had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. A waiter who served him recalled him appearing relaxed. Another staff member said they noticed nothing unusual. Security footage from inside the Ritz showed Henri Paul talking, walking, and moving in a way that different analysts interpreted differently. Some experts, reviewing the footage, said his movements were consistent with someone who had been drinking. Others said the footage alone was not sufficient to draw conclusions. The question of how impaired he actually appeared, and how anyone might have known, became something that haunted the investigation for years. And then there was the speed, the tunnel. The route from the Ritz on the Place Vendôme to Dodi's apartment near the Arc de Triomphe was not a long one. Under normal circumstances, it would take perhaps 10 to 15 minutes, depending on traffic. The car took a route that led it along the right bank of the Seine, heading west. This route passes through the Pont de l'Alma tunnel, a tunnel that runs beneath the Place de l'Alma, roughly following the river. The Pont de l'Alma tunnel is not, by the standards of major urban roadways, a particularly complex or dangerous stretch of road. It curves slightly as it passes under the plaza above. At the time of the crash, it had a speed limit of 50 kilometers per hour, roughly 31 miles per hour. The Mercedes entered the tunnel at a speed that investigators later estimated to be somewhere between 90 and 120 kilometers per hour. Some analyses suggested it may have been moving even faster than that at certain points. Inside the tunnel, the car struck a white Fiat Uno. The details of that collision, whether it was a direct impact, a sideswipe, or a near miss that caused the driver to lose control, became one of the most debated aspects of the entire investigation. The white Fiat Uno drove away. It was never conclusively identified, and its driver was never found, despite one of the most extensive searches of a single vehicle in European investigative history. After the contact with the Fiat, the Mercedes struck the 13th pillar inside the tunnel. The impact was catastrophic. The car spun and came to rest facing the opposite direction from which it had been traveling. It was approximately 12:23 in the morning on August 31st, 1997. The immediate aftermath. The first people to reach the car were not emergency services. They were photographers. Several paparazzi who had been following the Mercedes on motorcycles arrived at the scene within seconds of the crash. This fact became one of the most controversial elements of everything that followed. Photographs were taken inside the tunnel in the immediate aftermath. Some of those photographs were published. Some were suppressed by court order. The question of whether the photographers interfered with the ability of the first medical responders to reach the victims was raised in court and was never definitively resolved. A witness who was driving through the tunnel at the time of the crash later gave testimony about what they saw in the seconds after the impact. Their account described the car positioned across the road, steam or smoke rising, and people, some with cameras, converging on the wreckage almost immediately. The witness described trying to help and finding it difficult to reach the car because of the people already gathering around it. French emergency services arrived at the scene and found 4 people in the vehicle. Trevor Rees-Jones, a bodyguard employed by the Fayed family, was in the front passenger seat. He was seriously injured, but alive. He was wearing a seatbelt. Henri Paul, the driver, was dead at the scene. In the back seat, Dodi Fayed and Diana were both found to be in critical condition. Dodi was pronounced dead at the scene. The injuries he sustained in the impact were not survivable. Diana was still alive. What followed, over the next several hours? The decisions made by French medical personnel about how to treat her, the route taken to the hospital, the time elapsed before she arrived at a surgical theatre, became another layer of scrutiny that was examined in detail during the British inquest more than a decade later. The French medical system's approach to emergency trauma at the time differed significantly from the British approach. In France, the standard protocol prioritized stabilizing a patient at the scene before transport. In Britain, the emphasis was on getting the patient to hospital as quickly as possible, a philosophy sometimes called scoop and run. Diana was kept at the scene and treated for an extended period before being transported to the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital, which was approximately 6 kilometers from the tunnel. The journey itself, at low speed to avoid further injury, took additional time. She arrived at the hospital and was taken immediately into surgery. The injury she had sustained was to the pulmonary vein, the vessel that carries oxygenated blood from the lungs to the heart. It is an injury that is extremely difficult to survive under any circumstances. The surgical team worked for hours. At 4 o'clock in the morning on August 31st, 1997, Diana, Princess of Wales, was pronounced dead. Dodi Fayed was 42 years old when he died. Diana was 36. The investigation. What France concluded. The French investigation into the crash lasted approximately 3 years. Judge Hervé Stéphan led the inquiry, which was formally classified as an investigation into involuntary manslaughter. The primary focus was on whether Henri Paul's condition at the time of driving constituted criminal negligence, and on the behavior of the photographers who had been following the vehicle. The investigation collected testimony from hundreds of witnesses. It analyzed the physical evidence from the crash site, the vehicle, the tunnel, and the surrounding streets. It pursued the question of the white Fiat Uno with considerable resources. In September 1999, Judge Stéphan concluded the investigation and dismissed all charges against the photographers who had been following the car. The judge determined that, while the photographers had been in pursuit of the vehicle, there was insufficient evidence to establish that their presence had directly caused Henri Paul to drive as he did, or that they had obstructed emergency response in a way that could be criminally established. The conclusion of the French investigation was that the crash was caused by Henri Paul's impaired driving and excessive speed. The white Fiat Uno was identified as a likely significant factor in the sequence of events, the car that Henri Paul reacted to inside the tunnel. But its driver was never found. The Fiat itself was believed to have belonged to a French photographer named James Anderson, who was present in Paris that evening. Anderson died in May 2000 in circumstances that were ruled a suicide by French authorities, though this too became a point of contention for those who believed something more deliberate had taken place. The physical evidence from Anderson's vehicle showed traces consistent with having been involved in some kind of collision, though French investigators determined this was not conclusive proof that it was the car in the tunnel. Mohamed Al-Fayed, Dodi's father, rejected the conclusions of the French investigation entirely. He had, from very early on, maintained that his son and Diana had been killed deliberately, that it was not an accident at all. What Mohamed Al-Fayed believed. Mohamed Al-Fayed's grief over the death of his son was, by every account, devastating and total. He had lost a child. Whatever the complicated dynamics of their relationship over the years, and they were complicated, with Dodi spending much of his life navigating the enormous shadow cast by his father's wealth and reputation. Dodi was his son. In the months and years after the crash, Mohamed Al-Fayed became the most prominent and persistent voice, arguing that what happened in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel was not an accident. His central claim was that Diana and Dodi had been killed because they were planning to marry, and because Diana was carrying Dodi's child. He believed that the British establishment, specifically elements connected to the royal family, had arranged for them to be killed in order to prevent this marriage and the birth of a child whose father was Muslim and Egyptian. Mohammed al-Fayed made these claims publicly, repeatedly, and with considerable force. He named individuals. He pointed to specific pieces of evidence that he believed supported his version of events. He hired investigators. He met with members of parliament. He campaigned for years for a full British public inquiry. He eventually got one. The British inquest, formally titled the Inquests into the Deaths of Diana, Princess of Wales, and Imad el-Din Mohammed Abdel Munaim Fayed, began in October 2007 and concluded in April 2008. It was presided over by Lord Justice Scott Baker and heard testimony from over 250 witnesses over more than 6 months. It was one of the longest and most expensive inquests in British legal history. The jury's verdict, returned on April 7, 2008, was unlawful killing. But not the kind Mohammed al-Fayed was arguing for. What the British inquest found. The jury at the British inquest concluded that Diana and Dodi were unlawfully killed as a result of grossly negligent driving by Henry Paul, and by the grossly negligent driving of the pursuing vehicles, the vehicles belonging to the photographers following them through Paris that night. The verdict rejected Mohammed al-Fayed's conspiracy theory. The jury did not find evidence of a plot. They did not find evidence of a staged crash or deliberate intervention. What they found was something that, in its way, was almost more difficult to absorb: that 2 people died because of a driver who should not have been driving, moving at a speed that was reckless, through a tunnel in the middle of the night, with a convoy of photographers behind them who were themselves driving dangerously in pursuit of a photograph. The inquest examined, in extraordinary detail, every element of the conspiracy claims Mohammed al-Fayed had put forward: the pregnancy claim, the engagement ring, the alleged involvement of British intelligence services, the movements of Henri Paul and who he may have been in contact with, the behaviour of the photographers, the medical treatment Diana received. On the pregnancy question, pathological examination found no evidence that Diana was pregnant at the time of her death. On the engagement ring, the inquest heard testimony about the ring from Repossi, and the picture that emerged was ambiguous. There was evidence that Dodi had shown interest in the ring and that it had been delivered to the Ritz. There was no conclusive evidence of a formal proposal having taken place. On the question of British intelligence involvement, witnesses from the intelligence services gave testimony. The jury was presented with extensive material. The verdict did not support the claim that any agency had arranged or participated in causing the crash. And yet, and this is worth sitting with, the inquest also heard testimony that established a level of chaos, miscommunication, and dysfunction surrounding the events of that night that was genuinely difficult to reconcile with anyone's idea of a normal evening. The decision to use a decoy, the last-minute change of driver, the route taken, the speed, the tunnel, the photographers. Everything that happened was, in one sense, a chain of smaller decisions, each of which seemed reasonable at the time, or at least explainable, and which together produced a catastrophic outcome. Trevor Rees-Jones and the seat belt question. There is one detail from that night that never quite leaves you once you know it. Of the 4 people in the Mercedes S280 on the night of August 30th, 1997, only one was wearing a seatbelt. Trevor Rees-Jones, the bodyguard in the front passenger seat, survived. Henry Paul, Dodi Fayed, and Diana, Princess of Wales, were not wearing seatbelts. None of them survived. Trevor Rees-Jones sustained injuries that were severe enough to require extensive reconstructive surgery on his face. His jaw, cheekbones, and other facial structures were damaged to a degree that required multiple operations over a considerable period of time. He has spoken publicly about his experience only rarely and with considerable difficulty. He has said that he has no memory of the events inside the tunnel. His recollection ends sometime before the crash and does not resume until he was already in hospital. His book, published in 2000, was met with a mixture of sympathy and scrutiny. Some felt he was holding back. Others felt he genuinely had nothing more to give, that the trauma and the physical damage had taken from him the very memories that the world most wanted. Neurological memory loss following severe trauma is well documented and can be total. The brain, under certain kinds of impact, simply does not record. What Rees-Jones described was consistent with that. But for people desperate to understand what happened in those final seconds inside the tunnel, his silence on the matter was genuinely painful. The seatbelt question was examined during the French investigation and again during the British inquest. The inquest heard evidence about the culture around seatbelt use in the vehicles employed by the Fayed security operation. It was established that seatbelt use was not consistently enforced or encouraged. This detail, this one, almost unbearably simple detail, is one that investigators, journalists, and ordinary people have returned to again and again over the years, not because it explains anything about the larger questions, but because it is a reminder of how physical and how fragile the whole thing was. It was not just history. It was a car, a tunnel, and 4 human beings, Dodi's father and the years after. Mohammed Al-Fayed never accepted the conclusions of either the French investigation or the British inquest. He continued to speak publicly about his belief that his son was murdered. He continued to fund research into the crash. He continued to maintain the memorial to Dodi and Diana that he had installed in Harrods, a display that became, for many years, one of the most visited and debated exhibits in any retail space in the world. The display included photographs of Dodi and Diana, items associated with the alleged engagement ring, and a golden pyramid dedicated to their memory. It was a deeply personal monument, created by a father who had decided that public grief and public accusation were inseparable. Mohammed Al-Fayed sold Harrods in 2010 to the Qatar Investment Authority. The memorial was removed as part of the sale. He continued to give interviews on the subject of his son's death for years afterward. His position never changed. In August 2023, Mohammed Al-Fayed died at the age of 94. In the weeks following his death, a significant number of women came forward with accounts of sexual misconduct allegedly committed by Mohammed Al-Fayed over many decades. The allegations were serious, numerous, and spanned a long period of time. They were reported by major news organizations and led to a significant reappraisal of his public legacy. This context matters for the story of Dodi Fayed's death only in one specific way. It complicates the already complicated portrait of the man who was, for more than 25 years, the most visible and vocal person insisting that his son had been murdered. Dodi himself is not implicated in those allegations, but the father, who spent decades as the primary advocate for his son's memory, has become a vastly more complicated figure in the years since his own death. The tunnel today. The Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris still exists. Cars still drive through it every day. Above the tunnel entrance, on the plaza level, there is a flame. It is a replica of the flame from the Statue of Liberty, given to France by the United States as a symbol of friendship. It was installed years before the crash and was intended as a monument to Franco-American relations. But in the weeks after August 31st, 1997, people began leaving flowers and photographs and notes at the base of that flame. The flame became, by popular consensus and without any official designation, the memorial to Diana. It still functions that way. Tourists still visit it. People still leave flowers. There is no official memorial to Dodi at the site. There is no plaque with his name. He was, in death as in life, the person in the passenger seat. What the evidence actually shows. Across 3 decades, multiple investigations, hundreds of witnesses, thousands of pages of documentation, and one of the longest inquests in British legal history, the picture that emerges is this. On the night of August 30th, 1997, a man who should not have been driving got behind the wheel of a car in Paris. He drove at a speed that was wildly inappropriate for the road. Something happened in a tunnel. A contact with another vehicle, or a near miss, or some combination of both, that caused him to lose control. The car struck a pillar. 3 people died. The photographers who had been chasing the car contributed to the conditions that led to that sequence of events. The people inside the car were not wearing seatbelts. The route had been chosen in a hurry, under pressure, to avoid the very photographers who ended up following them anyway. There was no plot, no secret order, no deliberate interference. There was a man who was impaired, a car moving too fast, and a tunnel. And in the passenger seat, there was Dodi Fayed, a man who had spent most of his life in his father's shadow, who had found something that seemed to be making him genuinely happy in the last weeks of his life, and who was 42 years old and had no reason to expect that the night of August 30th would be any different from the nights before it. The investigations concluded what they concluded. The jury returned the verdict it returned. The questions that remain are not, for the most part, questions about what happened. They are questions about how it happened, about the decisions that were made, the conditions that were allowed to exist, and the pressures that put those 4 people in that car on that night. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, because the most difficult thing about how this story ends is not the mystery of it. The most difficult thing is the absence of mystery. It was, in the end, a sequence of ordinary failures. A driver who should not have driven, a route chosen in haste, a tunnel with a speed limit that no one followed, that produced something the world is still, nearly 3 decades later, struggling to accept as real. The legacy of Dodi Fayed. Dodi Fayed is remembered, to the extent that he is remembered at all, primarily in relation to Diana. His name appears in the same sentence as hers. His death is described as happening alongside hers. This is not surprising, and it is not entirely unfair. The relationship between them was real, and it ended the same way, and it ended at the same moment. But he was a person who existed for 42 years before that tunnel. He made films. He had friendships. He had a complicated family and a complicated history, and a life that was, by many accounts, genuinely his own. Not just a supporting role in someone else's story. His production company, Allied Stars, continued to operate for some time after his death. His contributions to Chariots of Fire are documented and undeniable. The film remains one of the most celebrated British productions of the 20th century, and his name is in the credits. People who worked with him in the film industry remembered him with warmth, even if they also remembered him as someone who was still, in some ways, figuring out who he was outside of his father's world. There is something quietly sad about that, about a person who spent decades trying to establish an identity separate from an enormous inheritance, and who, in death, became defined not by what he built, but by who he was with when he died. His friends from the film world have given interviews over the years describing a man who could be generous to the point of extravagance, who loved movies in a way that felt genuine rather than fashionable, and who had a particular fondness for the people who worked below him on productions, the crew members and assistants who most wealthy producers barely noticed. These details don't make headlines. They rarely do. The question of who Dodi Fayed was becoming in the summer of 1997, whether he was at a turning point, whether he and Diana had something that would have lasted, whether the ring and the plans and the possibility were real, is one that cannot be answered now. What can be said is that he was there, that he was alive, that he had a name and a history and a laugh that shows up in photographs, caught off guard, aimed at something just out of frame, and that on August 31st, 1997, in a tunnel beneath Paris, that life ended. The Pont de l'Alma tunnel has been widened since 1997. The pillars inside have been repositioned. The road markings have been changed. The tunnel looks different now than it did on that night, but the flame above it still burns. And the questions, not the conspiracy theories, but the real human questions about how something like this happens, about the decisions that lead to irreversible moments, about the people who are reduced to footnotes in their own stories. Those questions don't really go away. They just get quieter with time. Dodi Fayed was the man in the passenger seat. He didn't drive. He didn't choose the route. He didn't make the decisions that shaped those final minutes. He was just there. And then he wasn't. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.